It started like a whisper, a distant emergency broadcast cutting through the static of a forgotten radio. The sleepy town of Coldwater Ridge, nestled between misty hills and evergreen forests, had always prided itself on being quiet, safe, and blissfully ignored by the rest of the world. But that morning, everything changed. Sheriff Eli Braddock leaned against the hood of his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at the cloud-covered sky. The streets were still empty, the shops not yet open. Coldwater Ridge had a rhythm, and Eli knew it like a song. But something felt off today. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of birds. Not a chirp. Not a flutter. The first call came from old Mrs. Langley. "There's something wrong with my neighbor," she'd said, breathless. He's eating his dog." Eli thought she was exaggerating. The woman was 82, lived alone, and had a fondness for late-night whiskey. But when he pulled up to the neighbor's house and found blood smeared across the porch, and Mr. Haynes crouched over a shredded carcass with flesh clinging to his teeth, Eli knew Coldwater Ridge had just taken a dark turn. "Mr. Haynes," he'd called out, hand drifting toward the grip of his pistol. The man, if he could still be called that, turned. His eyes were milky, skin ashen. A chunk of his cheek hung loose, revealing yellowing teeth beneath. He didn't speak. He growled. Eli fired 2 warning shots into the ground. It didn't stop him. It took 3 bullets to the chest to make the thing stumble. A 4th, directly into the skull, finally dropped it. Eli stood frozen, hand shaking, trying to process what he'd just done. What he'd just seen. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled. "All units, we got multiple disturbances downtown. People attacking each other. I think they're biting. Dispatch is a mess. We need backup." By noon, chaos had consumed the town. Eli, with the help of his 2 deputies, Kate Monroe and Benny Yates, set up a makeshift barricade in front of the sheriff's office. Survivors trickled in, some wounded, some in shock, children crying, mothers bleeding. One man dragged himself inside missing half an arm. "No time for hospitals," Kate muttered, loading her rifle. "They're gone." It was true. The clinic had gone dark hours ago. No one answered the phones. The roads out of town were blocked, not by the military or the police, but by flaming wreckage and hordes of the infected. They were fast. Not in the sprinting, Hollywood zombie way, but relentless. Tireless. They moved in swarms, drawn to sound, scent, movement. Once they locked onto a target, they didn't stop until flesh was torn and bones cracked. Eli tried reaching out to the state police, the National Guard, anyone. But all they got was static, or worse, garbled warnings laced with screams. "Looks like we're on our own," Benny whispered, staring out at the burning horizon. The townspeople gathered inside the sheriff's office, about 24 of them. Some were armed, others clutching kitchen knives or baseball bats. Eli climbed onto a desk, surveying the room. "We don't know what this is," he began, his voice steady despite the fear twisting in his gut. "But we do know this, it's here. And it's not stopping. We've got to fortify. Block the windows, secure the exits. Work together. If Coldwater Ridge is going down, we're not going down without a fight." The townsfolk murmured their agreement, a few nodding, others still dazed. A teenage girl named Zoe, whose parents had been among the first attacked, silently passed out bottles of water. An ex-con named Mason, newly released and just passing through town, volunteered to reinforce the front door with scrap metal and wood. Night fell quickly. The undead came with it. They didn't howl. They didn't roar. But they scraped, clawed, and groaned. The sound of fingernails against metal and wood echoed like a sinister lullaby. Eli and Kate patrolled the hallways while Benny monitored the radio. At 2:17 a.m., the power died. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the survivors in dim, red hues. Mason stood beside a boarded-up window, holding a crowbar. "They're testing us," he said quietly. "Looking for a weakness." "Then we don't give them one," Eli replied, cocking his shotgun. Outside, the infected circled like wolves, their grotesque silhouettes illuminated by the burning remnants of the town. Coldwater Ridge was no longer just a town. It had become a battleground, the last stand of humanity in a world that had suddenly gone mad. And this was only the beginning. The morning came, but the sun brought little comfort. Eli stood on the roof of the sheriff's office, scanning the horizon through binoculars. Smoke curled upward from the west side of town, probably the grocery store. The streets were littered with overturned vehicles, bodies, and the infected, aimlessly wandering in search of sound, movement, life. Inside, the sheriff's office was quieter. Survivors moved like ghosts, speaking in hushed tones. Every creak of wood or echo of footsteps raised hairs and clenched fists. Kate took charge of organizing supplies. There wasn't much, some canned goods from the vending machine, a few medical kits, flashlights, and scattered ammo. They'd need to ration carefully. Food for 3 days, tops, she told Eli. Water's worse. If we don't find a way to filter or collect rain soon, we're in trouble. Eli nodded. What about weapons? Kate gestured to the small pile, 3 shotguns, a couple of pistols, Benny's hunting rifle, and a handful of machetes and blunt objects donated by townsfolk. We're not equipped for a war, Eli. We're just a bunch of scared civilians with a few guns. But they were all they had. And that had to be enough. Meanwhile, Benny worked to rig a basic communication system using salvaged radio parts. He was quiet, focused, the kind of man who didn't say much but always had something worth hearing when he did. At noon, Mason returned from a scouting mission. They're grouping near the water tower, he reported, breathing heavily. About 20 of them. Maybe more. Just standing there. Waiting. Waiting for what? Zoe asked, hugging her knees in a corner. Nobody had an answer. That night, Eli gathered the survivors for a meeting. The sheriff's office wouldn't hold forever. They needed better shelter, more supplies, and most importantly, a plan. We can't stay here, Eli said, voice grim. The power's out. The food's low. We'll be sitting ducks once they break through. So where do we go? Asked an older man named Harris, a former mechanic. Every road's blocked, and the town's crawling with those freaks. Kate stepped forward. There's the high school. It has a fenced perimeter, a backup generator, and a cafeteria. If we can get there, we might have a chance. The idea sparked murmurs of hope. But reaching it would be a gamble. The school was on the far side of town, a 15-minute drive on a good day. On foot, with a group of terrified civilians and undead in every direction, it would be a nightmare. We go at dawn, Eli declared. Pack light. Only what we need. We move fast, stay quiet, and we don't stop unless we have to. Mason smirked. And if we run into the Horde? Eli's eyes were steel. Then we shoot, stab, and keep running. This is our home. And I'll be damned if we let them take it without a fight. That night, nobody really slept. Parents held their children close. Friends clutched makeshift weapons. Mason stood by the front door with his crowbar, staring out into the darkness like he could see the enemy already coming. As the hours crawled by, the air grew colder. The infected howled in the distance, calling to one another. Communicating? Organizing? It was impossible to know. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going away. At first light, Eli looked out over the town. The streets were unnaturally still. Not a bird. Not a dog. Just silence and shadows. The last stand hadn't begun yet. But it was coming. The town of Coldwater Ridge had never seemed so eerily quiet. Dawn's first light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows over the streets littered with wreckage. A sense of unease hung in the air, thick as fog. Eli stood at the front of the group, his shotgun in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, survivors shuffled into position, Kate and Benny, Mason with his crowbar, and the others, mostly families with children, clutching whatever weapons they could find. Zoe, the teenager who had lost both parents, kept her head low, her face pale but determined. "Stick together," Eli ordered. "Move quickly, stay in the middle of the group. No heroics. We get to the school, and we make it a fortress." He led the way down the side street, moving cautiously, every step echoing in the oppressive silence. The wind had died down, and only the distant moans of the infected hinted at the horrors lurking just beyond the veil. The route to the school wasn't long, but it was dangerous. Eli had planned it carefully, avoiding the main roads where most of the infected had gathered. They moved through alleyways and side streets, trying to stay hidden. Every time they passed a broken window or overturned car, hearts raced. Minutes turned into hours as they slowly progressed through the desolate town. They passed the town's church, its steeple crumbling, windows shattered. The smell of decay wafted in the air. And then, just as Eli thought they might make it through without a fight, a shriek pierced the silence. It was close. Too close. Eli motioned for everyone to halt. He signaled to Mason, who quickly took a position behind a nearby dumpster, peeking around to get a better view. The others crouched low, waiting for his report. "About 15 of them," Mason whispered. "They're scattered in front of the old diner. Some are feasting. The rest are just standing there." Eli's pulse quickened. They were close. Too close. The diner was on the main street, the last stretch before they reached the school. He could feel the weight of the decision hanging over him like a dark cloud. "We can't go around," Kate said quietly, peering over her shoulder. "We don't have the time. We'll have to push through." Eli nodded grimly. "Stay close. Don't make a sound unless I tell you to. We move on my command." He motioned to Benny and Kate. "Take the front. Mason, Zoe, watch our six." With a quick nod, the group moved as one, each person doing their part to stay quiet and efficient. The town was more dangerous than ever, with the infected now becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable. As they neared the diner, the sight of the undead feasting on whatever they could tear apart was enough to freeze anyone's blood. But they had no choice. Eli glanced up at the school in the distance. Just a few more blocks. Then it happened. A loud crash sounded from behind them, followed by frantic footsteps. One of the children, a little boy named Tommy, had tripped on an old soda can and fell to the ground with a terrified scream. Eli spun around. "Get him up. Now." But it was too late. The infected, attracted by the sound, turned as one, their rotting faces twisted into grotesque expressions. They were coming. "Run!" Eli shouted, aiming his shotgun at the first of the infected charging toward them. Benny fired his rifle, knocking down one of the closest zombies. But it didn't stop. They kept coming, more and more flooding the street. Mason sprinted to grab Tommy, lifting the boy up and pulling him along, but not fast enough. The infected were too close now. Tommy screamed again, and the sound was like a signal, a command that the others were already on them. "Keep moving!" Eli bellowed, pushing forward as he fired another shot. The roar of the shotgun sounded deafening in the narrow street, but it did little to slow the relentless horde. Benny fired again, taking down another zombie, but they were everywhere now. Kate was the first to break away from the group, sprinting ahead to draw the zombies away. "Go! Get to the school," she shouted. "Kate!" Eli yelled, but she was already gone. She dashed across the street, her rifle raised, firing at anything that got too close. The zombies, distracted by the sound, shifted toward her. It bought them precious moments. Eli shoved the survivors ahead, guiding them around the corner of the diner, out of sight. His heart pounded in his chest as the sounds of gunfire echoed behind them. Kate was still out there, fighting to buy them time. Finally, they reached the edge of the school grounds. The gate was locked, but Benny, using his mechanic skills, quickly worked to pry it open. The others pushed inside, the gate creaking loudly in the still air. Inside the courtyard, they made their way to the back entrance. The school was fortified with a solid perimeter, fences, locked doors, and the remnants of a once thriving community. But there was no time for relief. "Barricade the doors!" Eli barked. "Move, move, move!" They rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound of the zombies pounding against the gates was deafening. They were here. But they were inside now. The last stand had begun. The inside of Coldwater Ridge High School was eerily quiet. The echo of their frantic footsteps on the linoleum floors reverberated in the otherwise still hallways. The survivors, now inside, quickly started to barricade the doors and windows, working together with a sense of urgency. The world outside had turned into a nightmare, but at least for now, this place felt like the last semblance of safety. Eli stood at the back of the group, his breath heavy. His eyes darted between the survivors, some older, some younger, all terrified. Despite the temporary security of the school's walls, a wave of dread washed over him. He knew this was just the beginning. The infected would find their way in. They always did. "We're not safe here forever," Benny said, wiping his forehead as he sealed a window with some metal sheeting he had scavenged from a nearby maintenance room. His hands shook slightly, but his voice remained steady. "This is just a temporary fix. We need a long-term plan." Kate, already on her knees with a flashlight, checked on a few of the survivors who had suffered injuries during their rushed escape. "We've got limited medical supplies," she said, examining a young woman's broken arm. "I can make do, but we need to think about food, water, and defense. I won't be able to stitch up the whole town if they get through." Eli nodded, his mind racing. He knew the next few hours, or days, could mean the difference between life and death. They were in the school now, but for how long? "Take a look at the blueprints," Eli said, directing Benny to the school's old utility room. "There should be a map in there of the building. We need to find a place where we can reinforce. Somewhere we can hold out until we can figure out a way to get to the other side of town." As Benny and Kate took charge of securing the building, Eli gathered the survivors in the gymnasium. The bleachers, once a place for school pride and student assemblies, were now the only semblance of shelter for the group. The walls of the gym, lined with old trophies and banners, now seemed like the last barriers between them and the world outside. "Listen up," Eli said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the survivors. "We have to stick together. If we stay calm, we can make it. We'll take turns keeping watch. We'll ration our food and water, and we'll make do with what we have. Most importantly, we don't let fear take over." The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. For the first time in hours, there was a sense of unity in the chaos. Some survivors nodded, others wiped away tears, but there was one undeniable truth: they had to survive. For themselves, and for the people who hadn't made it. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of pounding at the front doors. A low, guttural groan rose up from the courtyard outside. The infected were at the gates. The first wave of attacks came fast. The school's main entrance, the only large door they hadn't reinforced yet, was shaking violently, the zombies clawing at the wood and metal in a mindless frenzy. "We need to move. Now!" Mason shouted, his face drawn tight with panic. Eli grabbed a nearby metal rod, his grip tightening. "Kate, Benny, get to the barricade. Now!" The survivors quickly rushed to the front of the gymnasium. The barricades were holding, for now, but the pressure of the infected on the other side was building. The sound of their gnashing teeth and hollow moans grew louder with every passing second. "Stay calm," Eli ordered, his voice firm. "Remember the plan. We'll hold them off here until we have a chance to get to the roof or another exit." Everyone huddled near the windows, weapons drawn, ready to defend themselves. Outside, the infected had grown more organized. It wasn't just mindless roaming anymore. They had swarmed the area, clawing at the barricade with a relentless rhythm. Every time one fell, another took its place. They were adapting. Eli looked at Mason and Benny, both of them staring out into the courtyard. "It's no longer just an attack," Benny said quietly. "They're surrounding us." The tension in the air was palpable. The town of Coldwater Ridge had always been a small, quiet place. Now, it had become a battlefield, the last sanctuary for those who had managed to survive the initial onslaught. But how long could they last? The infected were relentless. They would not stop until there was nothing left to tear apart. And still, Eli could hear that voice inside him, the same voice that had told him they couldn't stay in the sheriff's office. The voice that warned him the fight was far from over. They couldn't just sit and wait to die. "We need to push back," Eli said, his voice resolute. "We can't let them take the school. The school is our stronghold. It's our last chance." Kate moved to the front of the barricade, where the door was shaking beneath the pressure of the Horde. "We can't fight them all, Eli. We need a plan to escape." "Escape?" Eli growled, frustration rising. "We'll escape when we have a chance to win." Mason, always the pragmatist, spoke up. "We can't hold the entire school forever. We need to find weapons, something bigger. We'll have to fight them off, or they'll overrun us." Eli glanced around at the group, their faces drawn, some of them already looking defeated. The weight of the decision hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a fight for the future. A fight for humanity itself. "We hold the school," he said, his voice like steel. "And if they break through? We'll make our stand where we need to. Together." The sounds of the infected grew louder. Their moans and shrieks now reverberated through the halls of Coldwater Ridge High School, growing closer with every passing minute. Eli's pulse raced as he surveyed the gymnasium. The survivors had taken up their positions, gripping makeshift weapons, pipes, metal rods, even broken chairs. Some had their backs pressed to the walls, others standing nervously near the windows, waiting. "We need to stay tight," Eli instructed, his voice firm as he moved between the survivors. "They'll break through soon. We have to be ready for whatever comes next." Benny, who had been rigging makeshift barricades around the gym's doorways, nodded grimly. He was already drenched in sweat. "The door's starting to bend. We've got maybe 10 minutes, maybe less." Kate moved between the injured survivors, making sure everyone was tended to. Her face was tight with concentration, but there was no denying the exhaustion in her eyes. She'd been up all night, stitching wounds, calming children, keeping watch. The reality of their situation was sinking in. "How much longer until we're out of options?" Mason asked quietly. He was standing near the exit, his crowbar still in hand, his eyes scanning the courtyard for any sign of movement. Eli didn't answer right away. He didn't know how long they could hold out. The infected were everywhere now, closing in on the school with a single-minded determination. Every sound, every creak of a door, every whisper between the survivors, seemed to draw them closer. "We can't hold forever," Eli said, his gaze hardening as he looked out toward the courtyard. The barricade at the front door had started to splinter. The infected were pushing harder now, and their groans were no longer distant, they were here. The decision had already been made. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to take back control of their future. But in this moment, Eli was acutely aware of how fragile that hope was. "Kate, Mason, you're with me. Benny, get to the back exit and check if it's still clear. We may need a backup route." Benny nodded and, without a word, dashed toward the back hallway. He knew the school like the back of his hand, having worked on the electrical systems and maintenance before all this started. If there was an exit that could offer them a chance of survival, it was through the maintenance tunnel behind the cafeteria. Eli took a deep breath and gripped a shotgun, checking the chamber. Kate and Mason stood by his side, their faces set in grim determination. There was no more time for hesitation. The front door's barricade finally gave way with a deafening crash. A flood of infected poured into the gymnasium, their bodies twisted and decaying, their hands reaching out with terrifying hunger. Eli fired first, the blast of his shotgun tearing through one of the closest zombies. It dropped to the ground, but there were more, too many more. "Now!" Eli shouted, and the group moved as one. The survivors scrambled for their weapons, the gymnasium transforming into a battlefield. Kate's rifle cracked as she took down 2 zombies that had breached the door. Mason swung his crowbar with precision, knocking a zombie off its feet before bashing its skull in. But the infected kept coming. In every second that passed, the walls felt a little closer, the space a little smaller. "Keep pushing!" Eli shouted, his voice hoarse. He moved through the chaos, fending off the zombies with every step. Each strike, each blast of his shotgun felt like a temporary victory, but he knew it wouldn't last. They couldn't fight this forever. Benny burst into the gym, wide-eyed, his face pale. The back doors swarmed. "We're stuck." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. There was no easy way out. No safe haven. They were surrounded. "We make our stand here," Eli said, his voice steady despite the rising panic around him. "We hold this ground. If we fall together." Mason swung his crowbar again, knocking a zombie away from him. He was covered in blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he didn't stop. "We can't just wait to be overwhelmed. We need a plan to thin the herd." Eli looked around. The gymnasium, with its wide-open space and high ceilings, was a double-edged sword. It gave them room to fight, but it also gave the infected room to move. The windows, previously their vantage points, were now weaknesses. The front door was a breach point, and the back was compromised. Then, a realization hit Eli like a lightning bolt. The school wasn't just a place of learning, it had resources. Tools. A way to fight back. "Benny!" Eli shouted. "Where's the old gymnasium maintenance area? The tool storage?" "Across the hall." Benny yelled, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. "Why?" "We can use those tools. Hammers, saws, anything to build barricades or set traps. We need to keep them from advancing." Eli made the decision in an instant. "Mason, Kate, you stay with the survivors. Benny and I will clear a path." Without waiting for a response, Eli sprinted across the gym, with Benny close behind. They reached the storage room, and Eli quickly began to rummage through the cabinets, finding long pieces of wood, metal pipes, and anything else that could be used for fortification. He handed Benny a large wrench and grabbed a heavy hammer for himself. "We'll need to make barricades fast," Eli said, his mind racing with possibilities. "We need to slow them down long enough to make a real escape." As they worked furiously, the gymnasium began to fill with more infected. The sound of their heavy footsteps grew louder, a constant reminder of how close they were to being overwhelmed. But Eli wouldn't stop. Not yet. They couldn't give up. "We fight to the end," Eli said, his voice firm. "There's no going back." The makeshift barricades they'd hurriedly constructed were already showing signs of weakness. The infected, relentless in their assault, had begun to swarm the gymnasium in greater numbers, their rotting hands pounding against the walls, the door frames, and the windows with inhuman strength. Eli's heart raced as he watched the barricades start to crumble, bit by bit. Every thud, every crack from the barricades felt like a death knell. The gymnasium, once a place of spirited games and loud cheers, was now a death trap. The survivors, weary from hours of fighting, were starting to break under the pressure. "We can't hold them much longer." Mason yelled over the noise, swinging his crowbar to knock down a zombie that had broken through the front door. "We need a new plan." Eli's mind raced. The survivors were running low on ammunition, energy, and hope. They needed something, anything, to shift the momentum in their favor. But the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him harder with every passing second. These people were depending on him, and he was running out of time. "We need to get out." "We need to regroup," Benny suggested, his voice shaking as he swung a pipe at an approaching zombie. "The main building's a death trap. We need to find another safe zone." "Regroup? Where?" Kate shot back, her eyes wide with disbelief as she fired at the mass of zombies pushing through the windows. "There's nowhere left. We're surrounded." Eli looked around, scanning the room for an escape. But the gym, the one place he had hoped they could make their last stand, was becoming more and more like a cage. His thoughts flickered to the plan they had formulated hours ago, to move to higher ground, to find refuge in the school's attic, where the infected couldn't reach them easily. But it seemed impossible now. Every route, every option was closing in around them. "We can't keep fighting this way," Eli said through gritted teeth, his voice firm but strained. "We need to get to the roof. It's the only place we can survive." The survivors exchanged uncertain looks, the desperation in their eyes more evident than ever. There was a fleeting moment of hesitation, but it didn't last long. The infected were coming faster, getting closer. "Move!" Eli shouted. They ran as one, charging through the gymnasium and past the collapsing barricades. The zombies, hungry and disoriented, were still pressing forward, but the group was quicker. They darted down the hallway toward the stairwell that would take them to the upper floors of the school. With each step, the sound of the horde grew fainter, but their presence was still felt, an ever-looming threat behind them. Eli's breath was ragged, his muscles aching from the previous fights, but he pushed forward. They couldn't afford to slow down. If they stopped now, it would be the end. The group reached the stairwell, and Eli quickly led the survivors up the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under their weight, but they didn't have time to be cautious. The sounds of the infected grew fainter the higher they went, but they knew it was only temporary. The roof would give them a temporary respite, but the horde would not give up. They needed to figure out how to make it out alive, how to push back against the overwhelming numbers of zombies. At the top of the stairs, Benny pushed open the door to the roof, and they all stepped into the cold, open air. The view was startling. Coldwater Ridge, once a peaceful town, was now a ghost town, filled with the distant, eerie movements of the infected shuffling through the streets below. But for now, the roof was safe. Eli paced back and forth, his mind working furiously. He could see the town's perimeter from here, the way the infected had spread across every inch of the streets, filling the empty spaces like a tidal wave. "We've got some time, but not much," Mason said, his voice low. He was catching his breath, leaning against the edge of the building, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But what now? We're stuck up here." "Not stuck," Eli corrected. "We're alive. That's more than most people can say right now." Kate moved up to join them, her rifle in hand. "We need to make a plan. We need to get out of this town. We can't stay here forever." Eli nodded, looking out across the town. "There's a way out. There's always a way out." But deep inside, Eli wasn't so sure. They had been lucky to make it this far. The infected had overwhelmed the town with terrifying speed, and the survivors had done everything they could just to stay alive. But now, the roof felt like a temporary refuge at best. In the distance, smoke was rising from several places in town. The sound of sirens had long since stopped. Coldwater Ridge had become a war zone, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the infected found their way up here, too. "Maybe we can signal someone for help," Benny suggested, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled horizon. "Maybe there are survivors elsewhere." "Maybe," Eli said, though the word tasted bitter in his mouth. The idea of relying on others felt like a far-fetched dream. He had seen too many towns fall to the horde to believe that anyone else was coming. Suddenly, a loud crack interrupted his thoughts. It was coming from the far side of the building. Eli and the others turned, their weapons raised. A figure had appeared, silhouetted by the setting sun. "It's them!" Kate shouted, her voice rising in relief. "It's someone alive." The figure stepped closer, revealing a man in tattered clothes, carrying an old hunting rifle. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something familiar about him. Eli squinted, trying to make him out in the dimming light. It wasn't until the man was only a few feet away that Eli realized who it was. "Charlie?" Eli said, his voice almost a whisper. Charlie, the town's former mechanic, looked back at Eli, his face pale but determined. "I've been looking for you," he said hoarsely. "We don't have much time. There's a way out of here. Follow me." Charlie's sudden appearance felt like a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness of their situation. His weathered face, streaked with dirt and exhaustion, carried a sense of urgency that no one could ignore. The survivors gathered around him on the roof, their bodies tense, weapons still in hand, but there was an unmistakable sense of relief in the air. "We don't have much time," Charlie repeated, his voice rough. "They've already breached the north side of town. The infected are everywhere. But I know a way out." Eli's eyes narrowed. "How?" Charlie pointed toward the west, where the last slivers of sunlight were fading into the horizon. "There's a farm on the outskirts. A small cabin. We've been holed up there for the last few days. It's fortified. I've seen fewer zombies out that way." Kate glanced at Eli, her brow furrowed. "If the north side's breached, how far are they from here?" Charlie hesitated for a moment before answering. "Not far. Maybe an hour, maybe less." Mason let out a breath. "An hour. That's not much time." Eli gripped his shotgun tightly, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only plan they had. They had survived too much to give up now, and the alternative, staying on the roof, waiting for the inevitable, wasn't an option. "All right," Eli said, turning to the others. "We're going with Charlie. We'll move fast, stay quiet, and keep our heads down. If we're lucky, we can make it to that cabin and regroup." The survivors nodded, their expressions hardened. They had come too far to falter now. But the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. The infected were closing in, and time was running out. Charlie led the way, his eyes darting back and forth as he surveyed the street below. The group moved quickly, ducking down behind low walls and alleyways, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of a broken door or distant groan from an infected sent a ripple of fear through the group. As they approached the edge of town, the scene became even more desolate. Empty cars sat abandoned in the streets, overturned and burned out. The buildings were scarred, windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. The town, once bustling with life, now looked like a forgotten relic of the past. Charlie led them to a narrow path that veered off the main road. The trail wound through a thicket of trees, the scent of earth and decaying leaves heavy in the air. The closer they got to the farm, the more tense the atmosphere became. The town's outskirts were a hotbed of activity for the infected. The further they ventured, the quieter the world around them became, but the sense of danger never lifted. "Keep quiet," Charlie muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "We don't want to attract any attention." Eli nodded, signaling for the others to follow. They moved in a single file, trying to minimize their presence. The night had fallen fully now, and with it came the chilling silence of the world on the brink of collapse. They were alone in the wilderness, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional groan from a distant infected. The farm, when they reached it, was eerily quiet. The cabin sat at the far end of the property, nestled between a cluster of trees. The barn nearby was still standing, its door half open. But there were no signs of life, no movement except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. Charlie motioned them to the side of the cabin. "This is it. We're safe for now." Eli approached the door cautiously, checking for any signs of entry or struggle. He tried the handle. It was locked, but a quick turn of the key, which Charlie had managed to find in his pocket, opened it with a creak. They entered, one by one, the door swinging shut behind them with a quiet thud. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single lantern. Dusty furniture sat haphazardly around the room, and a large fireplace dominated one wall. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, something they hadn't had in days. "We're safe for now," Kate said, her voice weary as she sank into a chair by the fire. "But we're not out of the woods yet. We still have to figure out what's next." Eli leaned against the wall, his gaze fixed on the fire. It was warm, but the flickering light only highlighted how much they'd all been through. How much they'd lost. Charlie stepped forward, glancing out the window. "I've been keeping an eye on things for the past few days. The Horde's gotten bigger. But there's something else I noticed. Some of them aren't just mindless." "What do you mean?" Benny asked, his voice tight with confusion. Charlie paused, looking uneasy. I've seen them move with purpose, like they're being led by something. It's like they're following a directive. I'm not sure what it means, but it's not just a random attack anymore. Eli straightened. Are you saying there's something controlling them? I don't know. But it's not just the usual mindless mob, Charlie said. If we're going to survive, we need to be smarter. This might not just be about getting away from the infected anymore. We may have to fight something much worse. Eli exchanged looks with the others. The weight of Charlie's words sank in, and a new fear settled over them. They had survived the zombies, but what if the real threat was yet to come? The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound in the room. Eli's mind raced, but the one thing that was certain in that moment was that survival was no longer just about escaping. It was about facing whatever was leading the Horde and stopping it before it could destroy the last remnants of humanity. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, the weight of Charlie's words hanging in the air like a cloud of doom. Eli sat by the fire, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. They had managed to survive so far, through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. But now, it seemed like they were facing a new kind of nightmare. Eli stood up, his eyes meeting Charlie's. We can't just sit here and wait for it to get worse. We need to act. We need to find out who or what is controlling the infected. Charlie's eyes were full of hesitation. We could be walking right into a trap. We don't even know what we're dealing with. Then we'll find out, Eli said firmly. We have no other choice. The others nodded in agreement, their faces hardened with the determination that had kept them alive this long. They had fought for their survival, and now they had to fight for the future, for the chance to rebuild what had been lost. All right, Kate said, standing and grabbing her rifle. Let's move out. We take the fight to them. They quickly gathered their weapons, and Charlie led them to the back door of the cabin. The night was cold, and the air had a biting edge. As they moved through the trees toward the town, every sound seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves. The distant groan of a zombie. The crunch of their boots against the underbrush. Every step felt like they were marching toward an uncertain future. They made their way through the woods, keeping to the shadows, the tall trees around them offering some semblance of cover. The town was just ahead, and the closer they got, the more the weight of their task became clear. They were not just facing the Horde, they were facing something that had control over them. I've been tracking their movements, Charlie whispered as they crouched behind a fallen log near the edge of the town. I've seen them gather at the old church. There's something going on there. Something different. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. The church had always been a place of sanctuary, a place of hope. Now, it had become the center of this nightmare. It made sense, in a twisted way, the church symbolized the heart of the town, the place where people had once come together. It only seemed fitting that it would now become the place where the end of humanity would unfold. We make our stand there, Eli said. We move in, take control, and find out who's behind this. The group moved quickly but cautiously toward the church, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual moans and shuffles of the infected now oddly absent. It felt like the calm before the storm. They reached the church's steps, and Eli took a deep breath before pushing open the door. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of candles and the occasional flicker of a broken light. The pews were overturned, and the altar had been desecrated, covered in bloodstains and debris. But it wasn't the state of the church that made Eli's blood run cold, it was the figure standing at the altar. A man. Tall, gaunt, his clothes torn and bloodied, but his eyes. His eyes were sharp, focused, almost alive. In front of him, a group of infected knelt, not attacking, not mindlessly shuffling. They were listening. To him. Eli stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. Who are you? The man turned slowly, and a cold smile spread across his face. Ah, so the survivors have come to face their fate. Who are you? Eli repeated, his grip tightening on his shotgun. The others stood in silence behind him, weapons at the ready, but none of them had ever seen anything like this before. The man laughed softly, his voice low and haunting. I am what's left of humanity's hope. I am the one who brought them all together, gave them purpose. I am the one who gave them life after death. Eli's stomach turned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This man, this thing, had controlled the infected, manipulated them, made them more than just mindless zombies. You're the one who's controlling them, Kate said, her voice filled with disbelief. How? Why? The man tilted his head. It's simple, really. When the world falls apart, you find new ways to survive. I've learned how to control them, how to use their instincts. The infected are more than just creatures of destruction. They can be a tool, a weapon. And now, they will be the instrument of humanity's rebirth. Rebirth? Eli spat. You're insane. Perhaps, the man said with a shrug. But I'm not the one who let the world collapse. You were all too weak. You couldn't save yourselves. So I gave you a new chance. A chance to rebuild. A chance to become something greater. By turning everyone into monsters? Mason yelled. You're not saving anyone. You're destroying what's left of humanity. The man's smile faltered. Humanity? What is left of it? You're all clinging to the past, to a time that's gone. There's no going back, no rebuilding. Only survival. And I'll make sure that survival is mine. Eli's hand tightened around his shotgun. Not if we stop you first. Without warning, he lunged forward, his finger pulling the trigger. The blast echoed through the church, and the man staggered back, but he didn't fall. His eyes narrowed in fury as the infected around him began to stir, their movements jerky but deliberate. Kill them, the man screamed. The infected surged forward, but this time, they weren't mindless. They moved with purpose, coordinated by the man's command. Eli and the others opened fire, but they were outnumbered, surrounded on all sides. It was a fight for their lives, the last stand for humanity. Eli fought with everything he had, his shotgun blasting at the incoming horde, while the others did the same. But no matter how many they took down, more seemed to come, filling the church like an unstoppable wave. The man laughed, his voice echoing in the chaos. You can't win. You never could. But Eli didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while there was still a chance. In a final, desperate charge, Eli broke through the swarm, pushing forward toward the man at the altar. With one last surge of strength, he tackled him to the ground, knocking the rifle from his hands. The man's grip on the infected faltered as the chaos swirled around them. Eli didn't hesitate. He pulled his knife from his belt and plunged it into the man's chest, silencing him once and for all. As the infected faltered and the swarm began to slow, Eli and the survivors stood tall. They had done it. They had stopped the source of the horde. But as they looked around the ruined church, the reality of what they had faced, and what was still left to face, hung heavy in the air. The world had changed forever. And the fight for humanity was far from over.